Welcome to the Ongaku Concept Podcast. I'm Josh.
And I'm Annie.
And this is a podcast where we discuss music theory through video game music.
As an introductory episode to the podcast series, we'll introduce ourselves and our involvement in video game music.
My first real experience with video game music was when I went over to my cousin's house one time, and he had a Sega Genesis, and he showed me Sonic 2 and Sonic 3 and Knuckles. And I distinctly remember getting to Chemical Plant Zone in Sonic 2 and hearing the music and just being blown away by it. And I was kind of like passively interested in video game music since then. I was never really big into it until I started getting into playing guitar when I was 14. And shortly after that, I was just bored surfing YouTube, and I decided to look up some old Sonic Adventure songs, and I thought those were really cool, and so I started learning to play those, and it just kind of grew from there.
I had a kind of similar process where I had a thing where I was like, okay, video game music, but it didn't become like a thing where I was really, really into it and I wanted to spend more time on it until much later, just like you. My first gaming soundtrack that I really liked, that piqued my interest in music and video games in general, was Super Mario and Yoshi's Island for the Game Boy. It was cute. That's really all it was. It wasn't anything spectacular to me. It was like, oh, I could use this as a ringtone. And then when I got the PlayStation 2, and when I was like 10, I got Kingdom Hearts and Final Fantasy X at once. And I opened up both of those games the same day. And if you've seen, lots of people are big fans of Kingdom Hearts because it's such a great soundtrack. But the opening cinematic, just like the Ongaku Concept episode you were talking about, it was mind-blowing for a 10-year-old. And I'm still a loyal fangirl of any music coming from Square Enix games, so that's where I am.
Yeah. So the way I got into studying video game music, I took guitar lessons kind of on and off. I guess I haven't really had any formal music education, but I took guitar lessons on and off when I was learning to play. And shortly after, I started my YouTube channel in February 2010, and I wanted to cover some Sonic Adventure 2 songs. And the problem was I would look up guitar tabs for those, and I either couldn't find any, or the ones I could find were really bad, so I had to learn them by ear. And so I just started learning every song by ear, and then a little while later, I started writing them down just so I'd be able to remember how to play them. And I started seeing certain things show up in the same songs, like certain chord progressions or certain melodic ideas show up in the same songs. And I started getting into studying music theory. And since I was really into video game music at the time, and still am, then video game music seemed like the natural study subject. So all of my study has been self-motivated, I guess.
Mm-hmm. That kind of makes me jealous. You had a lot of, because that's made you a much better musician, being able to push yourself into that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, transcribing, I do think that transcribing music is the best way to study things.
Yeah, funny is whenever I look up any of the K-On sheets, they're by you. I was just looking it up a couple of weeks ago, but so for me, I started playing music really when I was really young. My mom was my music teacher. She had taught me piano for like 6 years. I guess I started when I was 4, and then I dropped it for violin. And violin is such a competitive instrument that the only thing that people are willing to teach anyone on violin is just the standard repertoire.
Yeah,
and it was so, sometimes classical compositions are a hit and miss for me. I guess when I was really, so video game music came to me in my music education at a really emotional time of my life. it was in the middle of high school, and I wasn't right in the head, but I turned to the piano collection soundtrack from Final Fantasy X, from the one game soundtrack that changed my point of view for video game music altogether. And when I was going through the piano collections piece, I ended up playing 3 of them for a senior recital. And what I learned from that was that these were all written in such a way that really reflects classical music structure.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really cool. I thought, if I'm learning this in the classroom, maybe I would have clicked a lot better than I had to with Mozart or Prokofiev, who are excellent composers. I love their work. I just don't love the work that we were taught in the classrooms.
Yeah.
But I had to spend high school doing what I was told, and then but now that I'm doing music pretty much on my own, I stopped lessons for a while. I'm just learning songs from video game music that I like, which isn't really productive for violinists. But, as a musician, I think it's really good to tap into my interests, and that's where I get a lot of the work done anyway.
Yeah.
So I'm right now, I'm the one who's in control of my music education, which is great, and it's all, for the most part, video game music is like the focus, where the other standard repertoire that I'd been working on, I've kind of reversed it for myself, where they are now the supplementary to what I want to do, especially on YouTube. Yeah,
and I think also I would imagine that some of the connection you have with video game music is more personal because of what you were talking about, getting into Kingdom Hearts and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Where I guess you probably wouldn't have had that same experience with something like the classical repertoire.
It's a hit and miss,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a lot of video game music composers do have classical backgrounds, like Yoko Shimomura.
Exactly, yeah. The pieces I was working on from the Final Fantasy piano collections were all arranged by Masashi Hamauzu, who's to this day my favorite composer ever. And he was big on, you could hear it in his music, but I read his biography and I freaked out because I was like, we could be soulmates, but not really. Because he studied very closely the music of the Impressionists, like Ravel and Debussy, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is so cool. Everything just connects all of a sudden to me personally.
Yeah. So now I am focusing on trying to work as a freelance musician, just doing really anything, guitar playing, transcriptions, composing, arranging, and all that kind of stuff. But so aside from growing my YouTube channel, I also want to focus on teaching, which is what I'm doing with Ongaku Concept, because I haven't seen a lot of people do teach music theory through video game music. So I thought it'd be really fun to teach people around my age music theory through music that they connect with.
Yeah, education is great to bring in video games, because video games in general is just a good vehicle to teach anything. You take a historical video game, like my friends geeked out about Assassin's Creed, because there is so much history, accurate or not. It's just a great place to learn that. What I'm doing right now with video game music is I teach piano and violin at the beginning levels, and what I've done for myself for the past couple of years, I'm doing for them now, where I actually just started doing that this year. I made a New Year's resolution, sorry, not 2015, but 2014, where I would reverse the focus for them, for my students, because these were kids who are, I guess, born into Nintendo. I would see them, like, in between lessons, they'd go straight to their DS, and they were playing Pokemon or Zelda, and I thought, if they're not clicking with Baroque anything, Suzuki or whatever from the Albert series, then I thought it would be more effective to teach them things from the piano collection soundtrack. And I guess the easier ones. But I've noticed that after, it's been a year now, and there's a lot of progress for my piano students. It's difficult to do that for violin, just because I have mixed feelings. There's some things that you have to do for violin that's very difficult to sidetrack, build your own pedagogy and do that effectively. But I'm doing that with video game music for piano, and so far it's been a blast with these students.
Yeah, and I've listened to, like just the Pokemon tracks and stuff, and there's some really good stuff going on with different chord types and tritone substitutions and all that kind of stuff.
Especially with our YouTube friends, what they're doing with Pokemon music since
Absolutely.
The news with ORS, like Insane in the Rain's jazz album is spectacular.
Oh, yeah. So now we'll move on, and we'll talk about our favorite musical elements, just some of our favorite personal elements of music, and stuff that we see in video game music that is interesting.
As musicians, we all understand chromaticism to be things that are not in tune, but not within a scale of a certain piece. Like, it's the opposite of diatonicism, which is what that is, notes of a scale, and chromaticism is anything that's borrowed from, And I guess diatonicism is really important for all kinds of composition because it anchors a piece of music. And in video game music, when you need to anchor a piece of music for more looping purposes, as well as creating an atmosphere, creating a compelling track, but there's also looping that's really important in application to video games. So things like pure chromatic music we don't actually see often, which came from the newer tradition of Schoenberg and Webern. It's absolutely insane. I don't think anyone would want to listen to that. No, I'm speaking for other people. I've listened to some string quartets and I'm like, this is so ugly. I can't listen to this while playing a puzzle or something. It might be But when it does, there are some composers who we've looked at in the past where they have just a hint of that disorientating amount of chromaticism. You can have just small levels of chromaticism in your music for, like, I guess the harmonic minor is a good example of that, where you have the major 5 chord, because that leading tone is it's really popular and it's really effective. That level of chromaticism is really effective in music to get your point across, and resolve. Yeah.
Something I remembered was there's a song called Looping Steps from Super Mario 64 where you've got the staircase where if you try and run up it, it's just going to keep going and going and going unless you have enough stars to actually get up there, not counting glitches. But that whole song is nothing but this climbing chromatic scale, so it's not really in a key. It's just kind of climbing up and up and up with semitones. And that would be a good example of completely chromatic music. But it does loop pretty well.
Right. As I was listening to it, and there's some chords underneath that are functioning somehow to tie it all back together, isn't there?
Right. The
same thing was happening in that Bakura theme song from Yu-Gi-Oh! That I gave you.
Oh, yeah.
I hope you had a lot of fun with that.
that was fun. That one was... That's interesting, because the melody and stuff, or what you would consider a melody there, was jumping around all over the place, but it was kind of being anchored by this bass part that was just pedaling E, and I think later it jumped to another pedal.
Yeah. The thing about that was that it was specifically structured for like an A-B, wrap it up A-B, A-B kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas with the looping steps, you said it was more interactive to the player. Was that what it was?
Well, it just loops throughout the like if you go into that room, it just plays that song and it just loops and loops and loops. If you're running up the steps, the steps don't end unless you have enough stars to actually get up there. It's not exactly interactive, but it does fit the creepy, like, you can't get up here no matter how many times, no matter how long you run kind of vibe.
That's and I love that feeling that it creates in video games, because it I guess I gotta find a better word, but any note that you wouldn't expect to hear itself, just anything unexpected in a video game, and then in the piece of music that you're listening to can really psych you up for just about what you're doing in that video game. It's great. I love what they do with that.
Yeah. The primary purpose of music in video games is to create the atmosphere, or add to the atmosphere, I guess depending on the genre, but so when chromaticism is used, you can use chromaticism in all kinds of different ways to change the atmosphere that you're going for.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite examples, being a jazz fusion fan, one of my favorite examples of cool video game music concepts is uncommon time signatures. Because if you listen to a lot of music from the 80s, and even now really, a lot of the video game composers of the time were influenced by jazz fusion and progressive rock, which had a lot of uncommon changing time signatures. Like I know Koji Kondo was a big fan of Deep Purple and a bunch of other rock bands of that age. And in his Ganondorf battle from the Ocarina of Time, that song is in like this 13 plus 10/16 meter, where it's like a group of 13/16 notes followed by 10/16 notes. It's really crazy, and it would be kind of hard to pick up unless you actually studied it. But, just uncommon meters are common in video game music.
Yeah. And then how do you even count that? It's just a different way of... My goodness.
Yeah, it is weird. Like, for example, the difference between 3/4 and 6/8, it's really just the stress. I guess that's really all time signatures are, is different stress on certain beats.
Different stress and how you're going to divide every beat is also really important. I'm a big fan of asymmetrical meters too. Like, for the same reason that I like a certain level of chromaticism, that's the same reason I like uncommon time signatures, because anything that's a little disorienting it makes a really good feel that, I was going to say this. I was going to say, why do drugs when you have video game music? But I have no idea. Yeah, that's my opinion about chromaticism and uncommon time signatures. But along with time signatures, what I really enjoy is also the simple symmetrical meters too. It just depends on how they count them, how they divide the beat. For people will always recognize 6/8 to be the time signature for I guess Celtic kind of music. Anything that's swinging, not jazz swinging, but 1 2 3 1 2 3 or 1 enda 2 enda. And
also 9/8 as well.
Right, just anything over 8 is a really good, and can be divided into 3. It's really nice. Like, I was teaching my piano student earlier last year Troian Beauty from Final Fantasy IV, and it was really fun to just count for her, because I hate counting, but I don't mind counting if it's like 1 enda 2 enda. So I was just telling her next to her as she was playing root chord, root chord, root chord, come on. And it's really beautiful because it at least I don't feel anything when it's split into like simple meter 1 and 2 and 3 and, well, maybe a march, maybe a battle theme, maybe.
Right.
But 6/8 or 1 enda 2 enda just makes me feel so at peace. Yeah. Like I'm floating. It's such a great feeling listening to that meter.
6/8 is probably my favorite symmetrical meter. What are your favorite asymmetrical meters?
I like 5/8. I like 5/8. I haven't
5/8's
had
my favorite.
Yeah, I haven't had much experience with anything greater 7/8, but when I listen to it, it's, it gives me all the same feeling. 5/8 is much more common and for an uncommon time signature, and it's the easiest for me to count.
I remember Ivy Tran's Home Above the Clouds from Soul Saga is, well, it changes meters throughout, but the majority of it is in 5/8.
Well, is that opening too? The opening?
I think I haven't listened to it in a little while, but I think the opening was in 6/8, and then it changed to 5/8 after like about 10 seconds. But it's done in such a way that it doesn't feel weird at all. It has a really natural flow to it.
Another example I remember is the Dragon Roost Island track that Tetramino video game band just covered in their beginning days. I think Chris made the description, but he threw in a little 5/8 or 7/8, whichever one, something in there. And because the whole song was generally in 6/8 anyway, it didn't feel like that much of a difference. But when you heard it, it was like, oh, there you go.
Right. Yeah, I wrote a song once in 5/8, and I thought the transitions between sections could use just a little bit of extra time, so I made the transitions 6/8 instead of 5/8.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that. And really, there's so many different ways. You can take a time signature and change how you accent it to create a completely different groove. Like, there's a song called TOE, standing for Theory of Everything, from the Clannad soundtrack. And that's in 7/8 time. It feels like 6/8 plus another beat. But then there's a song like Mad Space from Sonic Adventure 2, where it just completely throws you off because the accent is on the 7th beat, and it's intended to kind of psych you out.
Right. Time signature is one thing, but accents is gonna blow you away, one way or the other.
So we've got a few questions. This is from both of these actually are from my friend Marvin Valentine. He's a really good drummer. You should check out his music. Let's see. How many common chord progressions exist in music, and which do you prefer when doing compositions? There are lots and lots and lots of common chord progressions out there. There's a few that I think are used more than others. Like there's the 4-5-1 progression, which I know you know.
That's the only one I know.
I really like to discuss chord function in another episode sometime, like subdominant and dominant and tonics and all that kind of stuff.
Right, I've been waiting for those.
Oh yeah, that's gonna be fun. Because I've been thinking about that a lot lately. There's like the 4-5-1 progression. There's Pachelbel's canon. There's the 6-4-1-5 progression, which if you've ever heard an epic movie theme, that's what progression's being used. If you've heard the Sword Art Online main theme, that's that progression. I don't really know that you can count how many common chord progressions there are. There's all sorts of them. As far as
doesn't that also depend on how you think about a piece of music is written? What I mean is, when I used to look at scores from Haydn or Prokofiev, I don't know, my teacher never encouraged me to think about the chords as phrases themselves, just melodies as phrases.
Yeah.
So I always looked at chords like, okay, one unit, next unit, next unit, next unit. That's why, like, the way I understand Montuno is like what you were talking about in another video with the same chord but a chromatic root movement. That's one of the only things I think about as a progression, where it is its own unit. But I've never learned to see chords functioning in a phrase the same way that melodies are. So. Yeah.
With a lot of pop music and things like that, chord, just like basic, 3 or 4 chords will be used and just kind of repeated over and over.
Right, the 4-chord template.
Right. Yeah. And like if you've ever seen the Axis of Awesome video, where they talk about, I think it was the 1-4-6-5 progression. They just played the same progression on the piano and then went through a whole list of songs that used the same thing.
The history of pop music.
Yeah. And so the 4-chord template's kind of a thing with simpler music like that. And I guess what you're saying is with a lot of classical stuff, it didn't necessarily follow that template. It just kind of moved where it carried it.
I think it did have a template. I was just never trained to see it that way.
Oh, yeah.
I'm a big melody person, not so much a, chord person.
As far as, like, my favorite progressions to use when composing, I love the 4-5-3-6 progression. I did a whole video on that. It's really, really common in video game music and anime music. I had never heard it prior to listening to that kind of stuff. And there's so many different things you can do with that progression and different variations, so I use that one a lot. I also like to use, there's this 8-chord, or I guess 8-bar progression, and it doesn't really have a name for it, but it's kind of like this cycle of 2-5-1s that just go down, like from like you have your 1 chord, and then there's a 2-5-1 headed to the 6th chord, and then from there
it's 2-5-1s of different chords.
Right, because like you have, if we were talking in the key of C, it starts on a C major chord. Then you have B half diminished, E7, A minor 7, and then there's a 2-5-1 headed back to the headed for the 4. So you have G minor 7, C7, F major 7, and then from there there's some sort of turnaround, which is usually different with other songs. But I want to do a video on that one because I've heard it a lot in anime music and video game music, but I've never once heard it before in a Western song. But I like that one a lot.
Oh, really? That's really funny that you mention it, where it's common in Japanese music, but not so much in Western music. One time, I was in eighth grade, and I was listening to a lot of J-rock bands, and my friend was kind of condescending. She was like, what attracts you to this music? I didn't know any music theory back then. I was just like, it sounds different from everything else I've ever heard, man. And she just laughed at me like, okay. But no.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, like there's a Japanese, I've been thinking about, there's something going on in Japanese music theory. I wanted to study that for a high school paper, but I never knew where to start. Mm-hmm. And Ongaku Concept is kind of getting me there.
Yay. I have not studied a lot of traditional Japanese music theory, and I know that it does affect their work, but it's just not something I've really studied a lot. I know a lot of the more pop kind of stuff that they've got is influenced by 80s European pop and dance music, because if you listen to a lot of Europop and like Italo disco and like Rick Astley, I'm sure everybody's heard the Rickroll song.
Yeah.
A lot of elements from that kind of era have found their way into video game music and pop music back then, and they're still being used today. Whereas I think in a lot of Western music, that's kind of died out
for simpler things.
It's like that progression originated in like dance music, like the 4-5-3-6. But if you listen to a lot of Japanese music, you'll find it everywhere. You'll find it in orchestral stuff. If you listen to like the Kin-iro Mosaic soundtrack, Shiro Hamaguchi did the sound. I know he's worked on a bunch of Final Fantasy stuff. He did the Tari Tari soundtrack, which is an anime, and he's used that a lot. I want to analyze his style sometime in a video because he's got some really cool stuff. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling about this now.
You have a list of Japanese composers to look through.
Oh, for that progression?
Yeah.
In particular, I like the 4-5-3-6. I know Ruka Kawada uses it a lot. She composes mostly for anime soundtracks. She's worked on the Kin-iro Mosaic soundtrack, the Gochiuman wa Usagi desu ka soundtrack. I'll put links to all these in the description on the YouTube video. Shiro Hamaguchi has used it a bit. Tomoya Otani, he's one of the composers for the Sonic the Hedgehog series. He's just recently started using it a lot in the Sonic Lost World soundtrack. Oh, also, pretty much anything from Pokemon. If you listen to Pokemon music, you'll find it a bunch. Koji Kondo as well. He's used it quite a bit in a lot of the Mario stuff and a little bit of the Zelda stuff as well, even though that's got a bit more of a cinematic feel to it. He does use that progression sometimes. And the next question, are all 7th chords known as jazz chords, and why are they called 7th chords? Or
jazz chords.
Yeah. And why are they called jazz chords? Jazz chords is kind of a catch-all term for 7th chords and anything built on 7th chords like 9th chords, 11ths, and 13ths. They're called that because they're just kind of the standard use for jazz songs. So just about any jazz song you use, you're almost never going to find a standard chord. They're usually going to have a 7th attached to them.
Yeah, before that it was all, when people studied written music from the European tradition, it was all just triads, 1 through 5, and that was it. I was going through a little bit of Bach the other day, and I found major 7ths a lot.
Really?
Yeah, it was so interesting. That's what people mean when they say Bach is timeless. I felt really emotional when I was looking through that because it's really beautiful. But you should send some of those to me because I want to hear. Sure, yeah, I looked it on Tumblr, but seventh chords are not new at all to jazz music. They just, like you said, they just made their way in for that kind of specific feel that really motivated jazz musicians of the time. I mean, it came from blues. I mean, a lot of seventh chords in jazz are actually not major seventh chords, but they have a minor seventh attached. Is that right?
Yeah.
And it was all part of their vocabulary anyway, as in the blues scale. But it was part of their vocabulary for American jazz musicians at that time, and it just kind of became natural to include it as a standard chord from that era on. It was also being used a lot in classical musicians, because as jazz was growing, so was, I guess, classical genre was growing with it. But seventh chords were used just for cadences and for writing for a particular color. And then now I actually don't know where classical music is going right now. It's everywhere in the 21st century. But we'll still call it a jazz chord. Because that's its home. Yeah.
I mean, if you listen to like John Williams stuff, he uses seventh chords quite a bit in his music, ninth chords and things like that.
Thanks for your questions. If you have any more for next week's podcasts, leave a comment below or email us at ongakuconcept@gmail.com.
Right, or you can tweet at Ongaku Concept, or you can ask at ongakuconcept.com/ask. I guess I'd better mention that the podcast is every week at Wednesday. Okay.
No, this is the only episode we're doing. You missed your chance to ask us questions.
Thanks for listening. There'll be a new episode of Ongaku Concept on Saturday, and next Wednesday we'll have the second episode of the podcast.
I'll see you next week.